So, good evening to all of you. And I, like my co-panelist, am delighted to be here and talk about these very compelling issues. I think probably child poverty is one of the most pressing questions that we have in this country to deal with, and as we can see from the data that has been presented, we are not dealing with it well. I want to begin by, and my job, I don't have a PowerPoint. My job is to just talk about key points, and I'm going to do that. I want to make three key points. One is that we often when we talk about poverty and childhood, I think one of the key problems in the United States is groups like all of us who've gathered here are often talking about other people's children. And I want to talk a little bit about what I think are some of the problems in that and what we can do about it, hopefully. Another issue I want to talk about is the problem of deep poverty, and that it's going to be very difficult to address that simply by creating high-quality early childhood programs. And the third point is that I think people who are passionate about these issues and want to change what's happening with young kids in America really need to organize. So let me begin. In addressing the issues of poverty and early childhood, we have to bear in mind that very often we really are talking about people and communities and children that we don't know well, and we don't know their experiences, and we don't live in the communities that they live in. Yet we feel that we can talk about them, we can develop research and policy initiatives to address their problems. And I think this underscores a deep issue, which is that as a nation, we really have insufficient communication and a sense of communal obligation to one another based on a shared set of understandings and experiences. We often, I think, view children of color, children of working poor families, children in impoverished ghettos and barrios and reservations and towns and suburbs, communities that we often describe as dead-end and dangerous, and that we don't want our children to go to, and we don't want to drive through, and we don't want to live near. I think this disconnect is deeply problematic. There are certainly at least two Americas. In the Occupy movement, we were reminded all of the time there was 1% and 99%. But I think you can perhaps think there are three Americas. There's 1%, there's 5%, and then there's everyone else. And the division of the two Americas in some ways can be looked at in terms of the segregation by race and class, in particular by ethnicity, to some extent by immigration status, whether you're a citizen or whether you're illegal, and other kinds of factors. The children of other people, especially poor people and people of color, may often be viewed by too many of us as deprived, as challenging, as at risk, even threatening. And we often, when we see them in early childhood programs, have already labeled them as at risk or in need of being fixed in some other significant way. Their intelligence is often suspect, their experiences devalued, their speech seen as ignorant and unintelligible, and the cultures they come from as impediments to learning and achievement in middle-class America. Their families and communities, confirmed by our own research, fail to live up to the task of preparing their children adequately for early educational tasks and achievement. Now, this perspective too often situates the problem of educational achievement and early school failure in children, families, and communities of color and communities of poverty, rather than in a society that actually divvies up the goods and resources based on issues of race and class. This perspective justifies an apartheid system of education in the US, separate and unequal. The first system, well-financed and resourced, is primarily for the education of mostly white, middle-class, monolingual children, but also middle-class African Americans, middle-class Latinos, middle-class Native Americans. And the second America is decaying, resource-starved, and underfunded, and it is for the general warehousing of children of color and the poor, including poor white children, and children who speak a dialect of English or a language other than English. Early childhood programs can reproduce these same class and racial inequalities, and they do. As we've heard from our panelists, inequality is built into our early education system and our systems of elementary and higher education. For example, in comparison to young white preschoolers, racial minority children and children in poverty are more likely to attend early childhood programs with teachers who lack subject content knowledge, have lower academic achievement, and are inexperienced. In addition, inadequate early childhood programs are part of a larger ecology that includes, poverty, racism, low-wage jobs, or no-wage jobs, in which there are communities in which people have not worked for years, and unsafe housing, poor transportation, poor health care, and so on and so forth. All factors that we know jeopardize children's development and family functioning. Fundamental transformation of the trajectories of children in poverty through early childhood programs may not be possible without significant systemic changes that address the level and the structure of inequality. And these inequalities, for example, are in federal labor policies that, for instance, the current debate or the debate that just passed on whether or not we should raise the minimum wage. Well, this indecision on our part, unwillingness on our part to address that fundamental question allows us to create or support a system of apartheid, basically, in our country. We can discuss poverty as an issue of children and how to fix that particular problem through high-quality early childhood programs. But economic justice is a more important question, and whether or not we're willing to actually engage in a significant way around issues of economic justice, I think remains to be seen. We haven't done so yet, and I'm hoping, I will be an optimist and hope that that's possible, but I think it's going to be a long time coming. One of the problems with this issue of other people's children is that I think it permits us to not feel a sense of obligation to others in our own society, our fellow children. We do I think of our own children near and dear to us, the children in our community, the kids we've seen grow up, but those other children are elsewhere, and very often they're hidden from us because of housing segregation, the way people live, and highways that take us past where they live. I think until we can begin to feel that all of these children who live in the United States, whether they came here with their parents or whether they illegally across the Rio Grande or whether they flew in an airplane or whether they were born right here, until we believe that all those kids are our kids, we are going to have a very, very hard time coming to grips with and accepting the policies that are necessary to address poverty. Now, let me go on to the second major point, and that is, I think that one of our, hold on one second. I think one of our problems around the issue of creating policy in the U.S. is also our problem of knowing and not being able to do anything about it. We're both stymied by this sort of other people's children problem versus our children, and our interest versus the interest of others. We're also stymied by the fact that we will not act on what we know works. I started in this field a long time ago. As John pointed out, I once upon a time was a Head Start teacher. And I was a preschool teacher as well and went on to be a college faculty member and now administer a graduate program. And I started out about 45 years ago when the field really consisted mostly of nursery schools and Head Start had just begun. In the past 45 years, the early childhood field has essentially been built, very different than what it was when I started. And in some ways, it has significantly addressed, or significantly maybe is too strong a word, but it has tried to address significant problems of kids in poverty, and Head Start is clearly an example of that. But one of the achievements, I think, of the last 45 years is really making the case to the nation about why early childhood matters. And for all of you who've worked on that over these years or are working on it now, congratulations. We actually have gotten to a point in this society where we don't have to explain to people, politicians, regular citizens, moms and pops, whoever, why early childhood matters. And last year in 2013, the first big survey I have seen that has significantly supported early childhood was done. And 86% of Americans supported early childhood education, and 70% supported early childhood efforts for infants and toddlers. Now, that is a remarkable change in 50 years. I mean, it may not seem that to some of you who weren't even born 50 years ago, but where we were before was basically women should be at home and with their children, and we are now at a place that is very, very different, where we see an obligation to make sure as a nation that young children are reared appropriately. Early childhood science has played a key role in all of this, as well as early childhood practice. And I think some of what Donna pointed out indicates both Donna and both Renee and Sheila have pointed out, is that we have fairly robust science that supports the importance of early childhood, but we also have problems in the implementation of that knowledge. And this is the problem of knowing and not doing. We know the benefits to young children, we know the benefits to parents, we know the benefits economically. James Heckman, the economist from the University of Chicago, has made the case very clearly and in many, many arenas that investing in early childhood is one of the most important investments this country could make. We get, according to his calculations, $10 for every $1 we invest, which for a government program is a rather outstanding payback. And it is a way to try to break what has been called the preschool to prison pipeline for kids in very poor communities. But despite that knowledge, and despite our passion for it, and despite the fact that we're a country that says we love children, we still won't commit the dollars to do it. That, I think, is in many ways, a kind of moral crisis for us, not just a political crisis, that we know what to do, and we will not, in fact, do what is essential. I think another kind of issue that came up in the data that Donna presented is just the issue that funding is such a critical issue for families, that this is very expensive for families to buy, and they need support to do it, particularly very poor families. I think another issue is that while we have developed policies to try to improve the quality of early childhood, those policies like QRIS or programs like QRIS in Pennsylvania have driven, to some extent, have driven change. But they also apparently are still deeply confusing to parents who don't seem to get the difference between lower and higher quality. And I think that's a very interesting issue. Let me go on, though, to what I think is the kind of third big issue for us, and that is the question of whether or not we can organize. And I think organizing is one of our greatest challenges, but one of our most necessary things to do. And it sounds like in Pennsylvania you are well on your way. And I come from a state where there is, from Illinois, where there is, and has been for 30 years, a significant early childhood advocacy community that has built up that's essentially a coalition between advocates, people like my institution and other institutions, big practitioner systems in Illinois, and legislators and foundations who have played a significant role in this. And over 30 years, they have built a partnership that has been very smart politically. They have argued behind closed doors, and when they go out in public and have to make a case to anyone, they do not let anyone divide them. They stick to their script and have been extremely successful, even in our state, in which we have, as many of you may know, many governors who support early childhood but wind up in jail. There's no connection between those two things, but we do have that unfortunate history. But we also have a state, and it's partly because of this coalition of early childhood supporters, we have a state in which for about 20 years we have not had a Democratic or Republican governor who has not supported enthusiastically early childhood. And that is a very important thing. That does not exist in many, many states. I think that what Donna's presentation suggested, what the work in Illinois suggests, is that if we're going to really try to move both the issue of child poverty and its connection to early childhood and the issues of income in low-income families and labor policies that keep people in low wages. I'll just give you an example of this. We have several federal efforts for the training and retraining of workers, but there are no jobs that often those people are being prepared for, or the jobs are low-wage jobs that keep people still locked in poverty. It doesn't lift them out of it in any way. So our tax dollars are going basically to reinforce poverty in low-income communities with families. So we need, I think, to do very careful and thoughtful work about developing a really strong effort to build coalitions, but coalitions, and this, I said third point, but that was the second point, build coalitions that bring in multiple voices of the people who we typically do not include in these conversations. One of the things that we have done in Illinois is tried to do that in very significant ways. And I think very often we have experts like ourselves who are talking about these issues to experts like yourselves, and this is a very circular conversation in many ways. Not unproductive, but in order to build this kind of larger movement that includes more voices, we're going to have to do something that's far more, takes us out of our comfort zone, takes us into those communities where people are in fact experiencing these high levels of poverty and social disorganization. One of the striking things about research on those communities, because we often see them as socially disorganized, there are studies, for instance, in Chicago where communities of high poverty have 150 community organizations in those communities, from block clubs to social groups to crime watch groups, all kinds of efforts. We're right now at Erickson working in one such community, and there are 40 organizations that have come together to work together around early childhood issues. Those people in those community-based organizations bring to the table these real-life experiences of violence in their communities, what's happening in terms of drug trafficking, problems they have with the police, issues of how do they get high-quality child care. They're very sophisticated in their understanding of many of these issues. I think we need to really both bring those voices together and also work to build a much more substantial movement around early childhood that gets us what we want, which is fully funded, high-quality early childhood programs and the wraparound services that support low-income families. And we want staff to be adequately compensated, and we also want, particularly in those most vulnerable communities, labor policies and work policies that really help lift families out of poverty. Thank you very much.